Good afternoon. This is Kim Faith, and I'm going to give you the first lecture of the semester. And hopefully, you find this helpful. But we are going to start with chapter one, part one here. I've tried to break it down into smaller segments so that you're not sitting here listening to a lecture for an hour, hour and a half, that you're only looking at, maybe 10 minutes up to 30 minutes is maybe some of the longer ones. So I have tried to shorten these a little bit. So the first thing is the question is, well, what is life? And biology is the study of life. And so biologists have to come up with a way to organize and we characterize living organisms. So one of the first things that we look at is order. How are things organized? We see this order in the sunflower, this nice radial symmetry, we could call it. And so we do notice that there is some kind of organization to living organisms. The second characteristic of life is reproduction. So, of course, organisms need to be able to reproduce more of their own kind. Third is growth and development. And so here we have, little baby alligator hatching. And of course, they will grow up to be anywhere from 4 to 6, maybe even 8 feet in length. And as they mature, they will develop into reproductive, um, mature alligators. Okay. That rate of growth and that development is controlled by DNA. All organisms are going to use DNA as their instruction set. And then we have this bear eating a fish, which has to do with chemical energy. And of course, all living organisms need a way of producing energy to keep all the chemical reactions and to oppose entropy. And we'll talk about that in our energy chapter. And then we have a response to our environment. So organisms, whether you're a Venus flytrap and you respond to an insect landing in the inside of your modified leaves, or running out of the building when the fire alarm goes off, you definitely need to respond. Living things respond to their environment. And regulation. This picture always cracks me up. So this male lemur is trying to cool off in this hot environment. And so we know that organisms have different ways of either cooling off when too hot or trying to stay warm in cooler climates. So again, trying to maintain the body temperature that they need in order to keep their cells functioning properly. And the last one here is evolutionary adaptation. Evolution is a theme that you will find throughout the whole um, field of biology, but we will specifically be talking about it in the last unit. So we know that adaptations are characteristics that have changed or evolved over many generations. Those organisms best suited to their environment will have what we call greater reproductive success, meaning they will have more offspring and those offspring will resemble the parents. And so you will see that positive trait being more frequently seen in that population. And we'll talk about microevolution when we get to the last lab. So again, to kind of summarize, we talked about order, we talked about reproduction, growth and development, energy processing. We talked about response to an environment, regulation, and evolutionary adaptation. So that is kind of the characteristics that we look at when we look at things that are living. So that would be what we would call. We're going to get into what's called vertical, or so vertical is up and down, or horizontal alignment. And so the first thing that we are going to talk about is that vertical alignment, going from small to large. Horizontal would be interactions amongst different organisms, which we'll kind of talk about too when we talk about communities and ecosystems. We'll kind of get into both directions. So the first thing that we do is when I was in high school and even in college, we used to organize things according to kingdoms. And we still do use the kingdom system, but the kingdom system can be a little messy because there's some organisms that don't really fit so well. So instead of trying to be really specific in our organization, we said, well, let's just break it down into something broader. And so that broadness is called domains. So the first domain that we're going to talk about are bacteria. Now, these bacterial cells are cells that we see most often. These are the common bacteria like your strep and staph that we see that we get infected with. There's another group of bacteria, or what we call prokaryotes. Prokaryotes are single cell organisms that do not have membrane-bound organelles, and we'll talk about that a little later when we get to cells. But these prokaryotes, these bacteria, are found in really extreme environments, and we call them archaea. You can think of archaea as an archaic, old, okay? So those are found in like really acidic environments, hot environments, salty environments. So extreme conditions we find are archaea. And it's really kind of interesting because we're actually more closely related to archaea than we are eubacteria, which scientists found that very fascinating. And then we have eukarya. Eukarya is short for eukaryotic cells. And again, those are cells that have like a nucleus, okay? And so pretty much every other organism besides bacteria fit into this domain. And now we're going to organize things. So that was kind of like a little bit of a horizontal alignment, but now we're going to get into the vertical. And so we're going to start with the biggest, and the biggest is the biosphere. So bio means living, sphere is a ball. So we have a ball of life. And so this is where we would find life on our planet. If we break that down into something smaller, we get into what are called either biomes. We can talk about biomes kind of fit in there as well in between. Biomes consist of a couple different ecosystems in close proximity to one another. But an ecosystem is an area that has what we call biotic and abiotic factors. Biotic are living organisms. Abiotic are non-living. So when we're talking about like rain, how much sun, what's the temperature, what's the wind, these are all abiotic conditions. And so whether we're talking about like a deciduous forest, a desert, a chaparral, a savanna, a prairie, those are ecosystems. So here we go from an ecosystem, we're going to look into something smaller. What's smaller than an ecosystem? Well, that's going to be a community, and a community just contains the biotic factors, the living organisms. So we have our lemurs here, and then we have some kind of succulent tree, whether it's a yucca tree, and then it looks like in the background we might have some eucalyptus trees. And so those are more than one species. A population would just be one species. So I have a population of lemurs here. Generally, when we talk about populations, we're talking about a group that is in a specific area that they're interbreeding so that their gene pool is the same, right? So that's when we talk about population. So we may talk about, yeah, we could talk about all the deer in Illinois, but you have a population in Moraine Hills, you have a population in Glacial Park, you have all these different divisions of deer. So those are different populations of deer. Even though they're all the same species, they're not intermingling with one another. And then we break that population, a group of lemurs, just to one lemur. And so that would be an organism. And so just to kind of rehash this, we go biosphere, ecosystem, community, population, and then the organism. So it's from big to small. We're going to go even smaller now. So with that organism, if I was to break that poor lemur down, I was to dissect it out, which you'll do dissecting in anatomy and physiology, it's going to be composed of an organ system. Those are several organs that work together to complete a task or a function. So we could talk about the cardiovascular system. If we want to break that down further, we would just talk about the heart. And then if we break that into something smaller, the heart consists of different types of tissues, whether we're talking about cardiac tissue or nervous tissue, all those different tissue types make up the heart. And then we can break those tissues down into something smaller, and that would be cells. So a group of cells make up a tissue, a group of tissues make up an organ, a group of organs make up an organ system. An organ system, a group of organ systems make up an organism. So we can go forward, backwards, backwards, forward. You will need to be able to do that. Now the cell, let me go back one. The cell is the smallest unit, the smallest functional unit of life. That doesn't mean I can't break the cell down into something smaller. It just means at that point where it does not meet all of the characteristics of life to be considered living. So the cell is the smallest unit, functioning unit of life. So now we're going to break that down a little smaller. And when we break it down, cells consist of organelles. And organelles are membrane structures. Are actually a couple that do not have, actually one, a ribosome, that does not have a membrane, but they are smaller structures. Organelle means little organ. So they are smaller structures inside the cell that perform a specific task. They have a job for that cell. If I break that organelle down into something smaller, we would break it down into a molecule. If we break that molecule down again, right, so even smaller, we would have, so we have a molecule of DNA, and that molecule of DNA is made up of atoms. And we will, in the chemistry section, break down atoms even into something smaller. So the atom would be the smallest functioning unit of matter. Okay, so that means it's this in the chemical world, that's the smallest unit that we would consider it being functioning matter. Once we break it down into something smaller, we can break it down into an electron, a proton, and a neutron, and we can keep going smaller and smaller and smaller until we get to what we call strings. At least that's the leading hypothesis that we've heard of, the string theory. As we're trying to describe, we try to break things down even smaller. We try to dissect things down so we can understand them. So we left off with our organism, and in this case, they are going to use a nervous system. So in that nervous system, we have a spinal cord, a brain, we have some nerves. We look at just an organ, we look at the brain. The brain is made up of different types of tissue, one of which is a nervous tissue. And we can break the nervous tissue down into nerve cells. And then we can break that nerve cell down into organelles. They're showing you the nucleus, and inside the nucleus, we would find our DNA molecule, and that DNA molecule is made up of atoms. So just to show you the whole picture, again, I'm going to go from small to big this time. So we go from atom, which is the smallest functioning unit of matter, to molecule, to organelle, to cell, which is the smallest functional unit of life, to tissue, organ systems, organism, population, community, ecosystem, biosphere. So again, you should be able to go from big to small, small to big. So like I said, cells are at the level at which properties of life emerge. A cell can regulate its internal environment. It can take in energy. It can respond to its environment. It has organization. It can reproduce. It can make more cells. So it has all of those things that we need in order to consider it living. All cells, like I said, are enclosed by a membrane. So we have a structure that kind of divides and protects it from the outside. So it has that the cell, we're going to talk about the cell membrane. The cell membrane, again, is a partition. It partitions that cell from the inside and from the outside. It allows things to go in and out. It chooses what will be able to come in and out. We also have DNA. DNA is the genetic information. We will find that is true for most of life. We try not to say all or none in biology. So I'm going to say most. There are two basic types of cells. There are prokaryotic cells. They were the first to evolve. They are the simplest. That does not mean that they are less successful. They have been around longer than any other species. They are very successful. Just because they're simple does not imply that they are not as successful. They are generally smaller than eukaryotic cells. And like I said, eukaryotic cells have those membrane enclosed organelles, including the nucleus, which has the DNA. And then we find eukaryotic cells make up plants, animals, and fungi. Those are different things that you should be fully aware of: plants, animals, and mushrooms, right? That's a fungus. And then the last slide here, we have a picture of a prokaryotic cell versus the eukaryotic cell. So notice that the prokaryotic cell, it's much smaller. It does have DNA concentrated in one area. We refer to that as the nucleoid region. It does not have a true nucleus. A nucleus actually has a membrane around it that protects the DNA from harm. And then notice all these internal structures in here. Those are those membrane bound organelles. And in a different chapter, we're going to learn about each one of these organelles. What is its structure? What are their function? So you should be able to compare and contrast a prokaryotic cell from a eukaryotic cell. So that ends the lesson for chapter 1, part 1. Hopefully you found this helpful. And again, as always, if you have any questions, feel free to send me an email and I will do the best I can to answer them. And if we need to set up a Zoom, we can do that also. All right, good luck with your studies and I will see you in the next video.